Some conflicts begin, rage for a while, and eventually fade into the dusty pages of history. But then there are those that never seem to end, conflicts that refuse to die, wars that leave no victors, only generations haunted by memory and vengeance. Israel, Palestine, a land sacred to millions yet soaked in centuries of blood. How can a single strip of earth, barely visible on a world map, ignite such endless wars, divide religions, topple empires, and stir emotions across the globe? Is it about land? Is it about faith? Is it about politics, power, or something even darker buried deep in history? Tonight we're not just walking through events, we're unraveling shadows. Welcome to the dark history of Israel and why this conflict refuses to end. To understand this conflict, you have to start thousands of years ago. The land we call Israel and Palestine has always been more than just geography. It's an idea, a crossroads where belief, culture, and empire collide. The Bible tells of Abraham, Moses, and David. For Jews, this was the promised land, the divine inheritance promised by God to their ancestors, the place where their covenant with the divine would be fulfilled. Jerusalem was not just a city, but the spiritual heartbeat of Jewish identity, home to the first and second temples. For Christians, this same soil carried eternal significance. It was where Jesus lived, taught, was crucified, and resurrected, making it a sacred landscape that became the foundation of an entire faith. For Muslims, it holds equal weight. It is the land where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during the night journey, forever linking Jerusalem with the holiest places of Islam. This overlap of sacredness planted the first seeds of conflict. One land, three great religions, all claiming it as theirs, not just politically but spiritually. Unlike borders drawn on a map, these claims could not be erased with time because they were bound to the eternal. As centuries passed, the land became like a stage with ever-changing rulers. The Canaanites built early civilizations, the Israelites established kingdoms, and then came the mighty Babylonians who destroyed the first temple and exiled the Jewish people. The Persians allowed return, but soon Alexander the Great marched through, bringing Greek influence. The Romans followed, brutally crushing Jewish revolts and scattering the population across the empire. The Byzantines, heirs of Rome, left their Christian mark before giving way to the armies. Each wave of conquest did more than shift power. It layered faith upon faith, memory upon memory, and grievance upon grievance. What was once a homeland became a contested symbol, and every empire that held it added another chapter to the story of struggle. The Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, a moment that forever reshaped Jewish history. With Jerusalem reduced to ruins, the Jewish people were scattered across the Roman world in what became known as the diaspora. This dispersion was not merely physical, it was spiritual. The heart of Jewish identity had been torn away, yet from that loss came an unshakable dream, the hope of return. For nearly 2,000 years, Jewish prayers echoed with the words "next year in Jerusalem," a constant reminder that exile was never meant to be permanent. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening in the same soil. Out of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, Christianity was born, spreading rapidly across the Roman Empire and beyond. The land where Jesus had preached became a beacon for Christians everywhere, a physical anchor to their faith. By the 7th century, Islam too would rise. Within just decades of the Prophet Muhammad's life, Jerusalem was embraced as the third holiest city of Islam after Mecca and Medina. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque became enduring symbols of Muslim devotion. It was inevitable that this convergence of sacredness would ignite violence. The Crusades of the Middle Ages turned the region into a battleground. Christian knights, answering the call of the Pope, marched across continents to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs, the Holy Land. Jerusalem became a city of blood, taken and retaken, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims were each massacred in cycles of conquest. To hold Jerusalem was not just a political victory, but a claim to divine favor. Then, in the 16th century, a new power swept in, the Ottoman Empire. For 4 centuries, the land came under their rule. Compared to the chaos of previous eras, this was a time of relative calm. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side under Ottoman governance, bound by a system that allowed each religious community certain freedoms. Yet beneath this coexistence, tensions lingered. Ancient wounds do not vanish, they wait. And as the world moved toward the modern age, nationalism, colonialism, and new politics, those old rivalries would find new fire. The late 19th century brought massive change. Across Europe, old hatreds that never truly died began to burn fiercely once again. Anti-Semitism rose like a storm. In Russia, Jewish communities were terrorized in brutal pogroms, organized massacres that left homes destroyed, synagogues burned, and lives shattered. In Germany and Austria, Jews were excluded from universities, professions, and government, often portrayed as outsiders who could never truly belong. In times of crisis, wars, plagues, financial collapses, Jews were scapegoated as the convenient enemy, blamed for society's ills. Out of this relentless persecution, a movement was born, Zionism. Its vision was simple in words, yet radical in reality. The return to the ancient homeland, the creation of a Jewish state, where Jews would no longer live at the mercy of others. For Jews, this was not merely political, it was survival. To reclaim Zion was to reclaim dignity, safety, and a future where Jewish children could grow up free from fear. But for the people already living there, Palestinian Arabs who had tilled the soil, built towns, and prayed in the same land for centuries, the dream of one person became the nightmare of another. What Jews saw as a homecoming, Palestinians experienced as an intrusion, a slow-motion displacement that threatened their identity, culture, and way of life. Jewish immigration surged, first in waves during the late 1800s, and then more intensely after the devastation of World War I. By then, the Ottomans had fallen, and Britain held control over Palestine. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, a single page that carried the weight of destiny. It promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but it was a promise made without consulting the people already there. Worse still, Britain had also promised the Arabs independence if they helped fight the Ottomans. Double promises, double betrayal. What Britain saw as strategy, the people of the region saw as betrayal of trust. Both Jews and Arabs felt they had been promised the same land. And from that contradiction, the seeds of endless conflict were planted deeper than ever, setting the stage for one of the most explosive struggles of the modern age. Then came the darkest chapter of Jewish history, the Holocaust. Across Europe, 6 million Jews were systematically murdered. Families were wiped out, entire communities erased, and centuries of culture and tradition nearly vanished in a wave of brutality and hatred unparalleled in human history. For those who survived, the landscapes of Europe were no longer home, they were graveyards. Returning to familiar streets or towns was unthinkable. There was nothing left but memories and unimaginable trauma. In this context, the dream of Zion transformed from hope into urgent necessity. The idea of returning to the ancient homeland became a lifeline, a promise of safety, sovereignty, and the possibility of rebuilding what had been destroyed. International sympathy for the Jewish plight grew, particularly after the revelations of the Holocaust shocked the world. By 1947, the United Nations, seeking a solution to the decades-long tension in Palestine, voted to partition the land into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan, seeing it as a historic opportunity to finally realize their millennia-old dream. For Palestinians, however, it felt like an injustice of monumental proportions. Outsiders were dividing their homeland, ignoring the centuries of life, labor, and culture that had been built there. Anger, fear, and resentment spread rapidly across the Arab world. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion stood before the world and declared the birth of the State of Israel. Within hours, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded, marking the start of the First Arab-Israeli War. Battles raged across the land. When the smoke cleared, Israel had survived, but it had also expanded beyond the boundaries set by the UN partition plan. Meanwhile, 700,000 Palestinians were forced to flee or were expelled from their homes. They called this exodus al-Nakba, the catastrophe. A new, haunting word entered the world's vocabulary: refugees. And with it came a conflict that would ripple across generations. A struggle over land, identity, and history that continues to define the Middle East and captivate the world's attention even today. The decades that followed were drenched in fire, a cycle of war and fragile truces that left no one untouched. In 1956, Israel clashed with Egypt during the Suez Crisis. Though smaller in scale than later conflicts, it demonstrated the growing stakes in the region. Control over territory, access to the sea, and strategic advantage were non-negotiable. International pressure forced a withdrawal, but the pattern was emerging. Violence followed by uneasy compromise. Then came the Six-Day War of 1967, a conflict that would redefine the map of the Middle East forever. Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, fearing a coordinated attack. In an astonishing 6 days, Israel captured East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. For Jews, many of whom had prayed for the return to Jerusalem for millennia, it was nothing short of a miracle, a historic reclamation of sacred land. But for Palestinians, it was another Nakba. Millions suddenly found themselves living under occupation, their lives reshaped by military checkpoints, sprawling settlements, and strict regulations that limited movement, work, and opportunity. Homes were lost, communities fractured, and the sense of injustice deepened. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated strike on Yom Kippur, Israel's holiest day. The war was fierce, brutal, and emotionally charged. Initial advances by Arab forces shocked Israel, but with US military and logistical support, Israel managed to hold its ground. When the fighting stopped, the front lines were barely changed, but the human cost was staggering, further entrenching bitterness on all sides. By this point, the pattern had become painfully clear. Wars erupted, armistices were signed, but no lasting peace emerged. Each generation inherited unresolved grievances, historical wounds, and the bitter memory of displacement. Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank became symbols not just of territory, but of identity, faith, and national destiny. The conflict had frozen in time, replayed over and over, leaving a landscape scarred by both the past and the unfulfilled promise of reconciliation. After 1967, Israel began building settlements in the occupied territories. What started as small outposts grew into cities with highways, schools, and military protection. Palestinians saw their future state shrinking piece by piece. Tensions boiled over in 1987 with the First Intifada, stones against rifles, youths clashing with soldiers. In the 1990s, a ray of hope appeared, the Oslo Accords. Palestinians would get autonomy, and peace seemed within reach. But extremists on both sides sabotaged it. In 1995, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who signed Oslo, was assassinated by a Jewish extremist. Soon after, Hamas rose in Gaza, launching suicide bombings. Trust collapsed. By the 2000s, the Second Intifada erupted, deadlier, bloodier, fueled by hopelessness. Today, the conflict feels endless, a cycle that seems immune to resolution. Gaza, a narrow strip of land home to nearly 2 million Palestinians, is blockaded on land, air, and sea, its population trapped, and its economy suffocated. Over the past 2 decades, it has been scarred by repeated wars. In 2008, 2012, 2014, and numerous smaller flare-ups since, each leaving a trail of destruction. Rockets fired by militants provoke retaliatory airstrikes, which in turn create new waves of anger and despair. Homes, schools, and hospitals have been reduced to rubble, and generations of children grow up knowing nothing but fear and instability. The West Bank presents a different but equally complex reality. Fragmented into zones under varying degrees of Palestinian and Israeli control, the territory is dissected by walls, checkpoints, and roads that favor settlements. Israeli settlements continue to expand, often on land claimed by Palestinians, making a contiguous Palestinian state increasingly difficult to envision. Jerusalem, sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, remains the ultimate flashpoint. Every street, neighborhood, and holy site carries deep historical and religious significance, ensuring that even small incidents can ignite large-scale tensions. Meanwhile, global powers continue to play their own games. The United States sends billions in military aid to Israel, strengthening its defense but also drawing accusations of bias. Arab nations that once stood united in opposition to Israel now make strategic deals based on trade, security, and politics, sometimes leaving Palestinians isolated. Iran backs militias in Gaza and Lebanon, escalating regional tensions, while Europe issues condemnations that rarely translate into meaningful action. The battlefield has expanded far beyond the land itself. It exists in media coverage, diplomacy, and international forums, and it lives in the hearts of millions around the world. Opinions are shaped not only by history, but by narratives, ideologies, and personal experiences. What began as a struggle over land and faith has evolved into a complex web of politics, identity, and memory, an ongoing story with no easy resolution in sight. So why can't this conflict be solved? It's not just about borders, it's about memory, trauma, identity. For Jews, Israel is survival, a shield against another Holocaust. For Palestinians, it's dispossession, exile, and humiliation. Every side carries scars, and scars don't heal easily. They're passed down like heirlooms from grandparents to children, from one war to the next. Add religion, and compromise becomes even harder. How do you divide a city like Jerusalem, where every stone is sacred? Add politics, and peace becomes a bargaining chip, not a goal. And so the land remains a battlefield, not just of armies, but of stories, myths, and fears, an endless cycle where history never truly ends. And here we are, more than 70 years after Israel's birth, more than 100 years after Zionism, more than 2,000 years since the first claims to this land, still no peace. The question is no longer just who owns the land, but can peace ever be possible when history itself refuses to rest? But remember this, history is not just written by leaders and generals. It's lived by ordinary people, families on both sides who want the same simple things: safety, dignity, and a future without fear. Maybe that's where hope lies, not in governments, not in armies, but in people choosing to break the cycle. So what do you think? Is peace in Israel and Palestine possible? Or are we doomed to repeat this cycle forever? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this journey through history moved you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the dark corners of our past and maybe help us understand the present just a little better.